Have you ever felt alone, solitary, isolated, as if you have no friends, as if no one loves you, as if no one cares? Well, always remember, you in fact have one friend at least. No, it's not Barney, Daniel Tiger, nor even Mr. Rogers. It is Public Universal Friend. Now, Public Universal Friend, also known as Jemima Wilkinson, is an actual historical figure who existed from the time of November 19th, 1752 to July 1st, 1819. And I will kind of regale you with the tale. So how I came to come across a Public Universal Friend was I was just going through Wikipedia because I love just kind of reading randomly on Wikipedia, finding new stuff to learn and just get interested and fall down a rabbit hole. I mean, I learned about the entire Posy conspiracy through Wikipedia. But yeah, so I was searching and I fell upon this character and I was like, what the heck? Public Universal Friend? Who is this? And I mean, the person looked friendly. I was like, yo, this might be my Universal Friend, bro. So I went to searching. And I'll just kind of tell you the life of Public Universal Friend. So, Jemima Wilkinson was born on, as I said, November 19th, 1752, to a relatively, well-off family. She was born biologically female, which is a necessary indicator, not indicator, but necessary point to remember because events later on will kind of change that. But yeah, so born, like I said, to a pretty well-off family, and she grew up, and I believe she lost her mother around the age of 12 to 13, so she did have a little bit of sorrow there, but she grew up very healthy. She was healthy, she was strong, and she was noted as being a phenomenal equestrian, which lasted throughout her entire life, which actually comes into play later on in the story. But yeah, she had well-off family. She was also mentioned as being very academic, very much so a bookworm. She actually had learned major scriptures throughout the Bible just straight in memory, which is also another important fact that comes back later on. But yeah, she's a very smart, strong young girl. And she and her family were Quakers, and so they followed the Quaker belief. Now, I personally don't know much about the theology of Quakers. I know they make good rice cakes and oats, which I'm not a fan of, but yeah, I do know that they kind of focus on a more, personalized relationship with God, and, they do also believe that revelation still happens in, the modern era, and that individuals can have revelations, or prophetic visions, whatever you want to call them. So that is also another important thing that comes along. But as we see, as Jemima's, or I'm going to say Jemima, her name is spelled Gemima. I don't know if that's how the syrup is spelled, but yeah. So Jemima lived a pretty good life. She went along and progressed, and her family did have some trouble here. As we grow closer to the main event of Jemima's life and the formation of Public Universal Friend, we see as her family started to have falling outs with the Quakers. Now, I'll just this kind of ties into my theory about it. And Quakers refer to themselves as the Society of Friends. And so we see as her family started to have falling outs with the Society of Friends because one of her sisters committed adultery. We see as two of her brothers ultimately ended up being kicked from the Society of Friends because they weren't pacifists. And so we kind of see as they start having fallen outs. And well, during this time, Jemima became under a lot of stress. And so we see until this all builds up to October of 1776, the year that our good old Declaration of Independence was signed. If you didn't know, that's the call of the North American bald eagle. But yeah, also one thing I forgot to mention was just kind of speak on the prominence of the Wilkinson's family, was that they in fact were related to Stephen Hopkins, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, which is a cool little addendum there. But yeah, so we see this, you get to October 1776, and Jemima comes down with a bad case of what is presumably believed to be typhus, and she has an immense fever, like a absurdly high fever, and it looks as if she's going to die. And through this, we see that the fever eventually breaks. Now, no one ever reported her dying. They say, yes, she was in bad straits, but they say she never died. However, Jemima wakes up a completely different character. She wakes up as Public Universal Friend. Now, I will refer to them as the Friend from here on, because that is what they would explicitly allow themselves to be referred to as. So they come out of this sleep, and they are now declaring themselves to be Public Universal Friend, or PUF, or simply the Friend. She's also referred to as the Preacher. Oh, they're also referred to as the Preacher. I'm sorry getting that stuff mixed up. But yeah, so here they end up mentioning that they have been given a revelation from God that there is immense room in the mansions of heaven, and that they have come down here to spread the word of this. And we see as other people are kind of like, yeah, it is possible that she died, but they say she never in fact did die, or Jemima, this is speaking of. But I'm gonna say Puff, P-U-F, but the friend, in fact, declares they did die, went to heaven, got revelation from God, and the soul of Jemima remained in heaven, and another soul has now occupied the body of Puff. So, now we see as the ministry of the friend begins. So, like I said, the friend declared to have divine revelation from God and to have a new spirit within their body, and they also now have declared that they are, in fact, a genderless entity. And this is supported by, I believe it was Galatians 3:28, which states that it kind of elaborates on like Greeks, Jews, whatever, male, female, all in Christ we are all united, which I don't believe is really speaking in a biological sense, but this is what the friend used to defend this stance, which is honestly good backing, but also we can see that the nature of them being a female biologically could be an issue, because I believe it's 1 Timothy 2:10 through 11, which kind of denounces like the actions of women preaching, which if the friend was in fact neither, then it is okay for them to preach in this instance. But yeah, so what we see is the preacher starts to go out, and the preacher ultimately ends up building a pretty good following. They end up going about like the areas of the Northeast, like Rhode Island, where they were born. They were born in I don't know if I mentioned this, but they were born specifically in Cumberland, Rhode Island. And goes around spreading, like I said, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, kind of just the like New York, kind of just those northeastern countries that were a part of the United States at the time, though it technically wasn't. Well, it was the United States after 1776. Obviously after the signing of the Declaration of Independence and all that. But yeah, so we see this goes about, starts preaching, and spreads the word. Now we see that no really like crazy theological like points come up from this massive change in Jemima. Now that they are the friend, they're really just spreading general Quaker theology. They're even accused of plagiarizing earlier writings by Quakers, but they were just going around and spreading Quaker word. Like, they were spreading pretty good ideas too. Like, yeah, the big problem I kind of have with them is not preaching election or predestination, because they were like, nah, and they kind of believed also in universal crap. Is it universal sanctification or universal salvation? So I kind of get some issues with that, because honestly, I believe personally that if God is all-powerful, which God is all-powerful, then he can control who is there. And if he knows who's going to go there, then he, in fact, has the ability to control. I mean, I don't know if I necessarily believe in election. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. I know I probably do believe in predestination, but not election. I don't know. I have to see it, because I kind of do lean toward election, but I just really don't know. But yeah, so it is a very complex topic, so I'm really okay with them preaching against that, because, I mean, each to their own, really. But yeah, so we see that they end up going about preaching stuff like this. They, in fact, also do not carry a Bible with them when they're preaching, because, as I mentioned earlier, Jemima had memorized a lot of the Bible in memory, like major scriptures, and the Public Universal Friend, in fact, memorized the scripture as well and was preaching it just straight off the dome, which is really impressive. But yeah, so we see as they start going about, like I said, spreading the word. They also spread like general like good society stuff, like promoting women and everything, like promoting their rights. They supported abolition of slavery, and even like pushed members of which would eventually become to be known as the Society of Universal Friends instead of the Society of Friends like the Quakers have. They are now this schismatic group, the Society of Universal Friends. And so we see as they began to push even like slave owners within that community to give up their slaves and allow them to become free men. There was even African Americans among the Society of Universal Friends, which is really cool, especially this early on in American history. Like, this stuff is happening like between 1776 and 1819. So that's pretty cool. And like I said, we also see as they support a lot of women's rights. They mention about how women should be ruled by God and not by men, which is based, honestly, because, I mean, yeah, there is scripture that supports the, like, control, but, like, I don't think it should be diminutive control, like, husband and wife, yeah, but, like, God being I'm not really opinionated on this, so God being the controlling factor is what I believe is right, because God is the ruler of all, so yeah. But with this, we see as, like I said, continue to progress, their following builds. We get introduced to this character by the name of Sarah Richards, who I believe the friend met in 1785. And this woman ultimately ended up, her husband ended up dying, ending a kind of unhappy marriage that they had. And Sarah ends up coming along with the friend, becoming known as Sarah Friend, becoming the friend's most, like, followed disciple. And we kind of see this story progress. She keeps going around giving speeches, giving like peace and love speeches. We in fact actually see that at one point she gets in cahoots with a government official and gives a speech to the U.S. government and the Iroquois tribe of Native Americans, and just speaks about peace and love, which is really cool for this arguably cultist leader. But yeah, I personally don't believe they're cultists, but I'll get into that later. But yeah, so we see as the friend continues to progress throughout, and we see as she in fact has some run-ins with the law and stuff like that, because people start to accuse. Oh well, I'm sorry for referring to her as her. And it's kind of hard since you go from referring to Jemima as her, now the friend as them. But yeah, so the friend ends up running into the law occasionally because of being accused of blasphemy by a few people who are kind of like, I don't really much like them. So we see in multiple instances that the law ends up coming after them for blasphemy. At one point, they come at her on horseback, or come at them on horseback, and the friend ends up using their phenomenal equestrian skills that they've had their whole life to escape on horseback, which is really cool. Then at one point, they sent like a bunch of men, and apparently like a bunch of the women within the Society of Universal Friends fought off these like lawmen who had come, and like tore at their clothes and all that, so they're going like ravenous on them. And then we see as the final confrontation with the law happens, where we see as 30 lawmen are sent after the friend, and ultimately they do end up taking them, but they are ultimately deemed unable to be transported due to their illnesses, which they had for about the last 19 years of their life. But yeah, so I'll kind of just stop here and give a brief description of the friend. Now, the friend. So, after having become this genderless spirit within the body of Jemima Wilkinson, we see as the friend started to dress in what could be described as as an androgynous style, because they wore clothing that was neither indicating being manly or of feminine nature. So it's kind of following what the doctrine that she claimed that happened and occurred following the events that happened supposedly during her typhus fever, or their typhus fever. And so we see as this kind of became a important part of the character. We also see as there's reports throughout her speeches and throughout their speeches and all that. Golly, I'm getting this mixed up all the time. But yeah, throughout their speeches, that they in fact didn't really have a determinable like gender in their voice. We see as some people report that it had more of they had more of like a masculine and raspy voice, while other ones mention how they're like very eloquent and feminine in their vocals. So yeah, it's very cool to see what's going on here. But yeah, also I'll kind of mention the establishment of the commune. So we see that, in fact, during their time, during the, Universal Society, the Society of Universal Friends time, they ultimately grew to such a large, community that they ended up going and building a town known as the Gore. And they also ended up establishing this, going into this town of Jerusalem in New York. And so there is kind of a cult-like situation going on here, because we see as a commune is being established, that the Gore was essentially a commune. That's what it was. It was meant for the Society of Universal Friends to reside in. And so we also see these odd similarities to other cult leaders. As we know, we see that the main head, the Public Universal Friend, in fact, has revelation, has visions. We also saw earlier on in the Public Universal Friends ministry that 2 members believed that they were in fact the 2 witnesses in Revelation. So we see interpretation of Revelations, a cult leader who has this belief that they have received prophetic vision, and a commune forming. However, what this differs in from most cults is that it's not violent at all. There's nothing going on here besides a person who wants to spread the word of God because they believe they received a prophetic vision, and some other people in the group believing that they are of biblical significance. But yeah, we don't see anything of harm ever come from them. They actually, the Public Universal Friend, in fact, supported a lot of like anti-violent stuff. Like obviously, they were against slavery. They promoted abstinence, though not necessarily. They didn't demand celibacy. They were kind of against marriage, but honestly, they were like, if it's either marriage or something to be born of wedlock, they're like, yeah, be married. So the Public Universal Friend was generally just kind of promoting, I guess, general theological and religious ideas. But yeah, so they, like I said, I personally don't believe that they were a cult leader. I know that they had very much so similarities to a cult leader, but I believe determining them to be a cult leader is too harsh. I believe they are a schismatic sect which simply lived somewhere. I think the commune part of it is kind of the most determining fact to make them a cult, but like, I don't really see them as a cult, I don't really see the Society of Universal Friends as a cult. But yeah, so I guess I'll kind of get into the later life of the Public Universal Friend. Like I said, for the last 19 years of their life, they kind of suffered from general edema, which is like swelling within the body and all of that. And this progressed on until ultimately on July 1st of 1819, they had a bad spell like the previous days prior, and ultimately they ended up dying to this edema. And we see then the Society of Universal Friends, in fact, did continue to live on after the death of the Public Universal Friend. However, their death did kind of lead to a downfall of the, I guess, sect as a whole. And in the 1860s, it essentially completely died out because they, like I said, they were kind of a abstinence supporting celibate group, so they didn't have many kids coming into the fray, and they were unable to really attract any newcomers without the presence of the Public Universal Friend. And also, the other main disciple of the Public Universal Friend, Sarah Friend, or what was her name? Sarah Richards, had already died before that. I believe she died in 1793 or 94. But yeah, so that is the entire life of the Public Universal Friend. Now, I'll kind of get into some other stuff, like some controversy. Like, obviously, there's a controversy of them promoting blasphemy, though, they didn't really, I don't necessarily believe they did. Now, it could be determined as heretical, but, not necessarily blasphemy. But yeah, so it was just a very chill life, for them to have been kind of a very controversial thing. They promoted generally good ideas. They didn't go off the deep end like a lot of cult leaders do when they declare themselves to be I'm this prophet. I mean, they never really declared themselves to be a prophet. They were just I'm here to spread the word. I got a vision from God, and my soul has been replaced by this genderless being from heaven. So, like I said, yeah, there is some biblical backing to that. Like I said, I don't really believe it depends on, is determining biological. But there is, like I said, Galatians 3:28 does kind of support their idea. And we see that they didn't really have a decline. And it's kind of hard to believe that this could have been something that arose from mental deficiency or mental, damage to the brain, possibly from the fever with typhus, because we see that their, memories were intact. Everything but their person was up to snuff, still a great equestrian, still a magnificent memory, being able to recite a lot of the Bible from right off the dome, which is really crazy. But yeah, so that was my main theory behind it. So if I'm really going to propose what this was, if it's not just a person, if it's not what the story promotes, then what I'm going to propose is this theory here. So I believe what happened here was the family of the Wilkinsons was generally jaded off of having been, I guess, ostracized from the Society of Friends, the Quakers and all of that, after the events that happened in 1776 and a little bit prior. And after seeing, what's her name? Jemima undergo this fever and all that, possibly having some effect from the fever, some possible brain damage or something like that, they come out as the Public Universal Friend. And with this, I believe the family ended up spreading this word, because we see that the family of Jemima, or the Public Universal Friend, were some of the first among them who joined the Society of Universal Friends. And I believe this was really just to spite at the Quakers and the Society of Friends, because they had been ostracized and they had essentially become isolated, so they needed something to get back. They wanted their revenge, possibly. So we see as the family takes advantage of this event that Jemima is declaring, and then go crazy with it. I mean, it didn't really go crazy, just kind of blow up with it, kind of go against the Quakers. I mean, they didn't really even go against the Quakers. The theology was generally the same, but So, yeah, that's kind of my theory on it. I don't necessarily believe that's true, but, I mean, there is cases where the brain can be damaged with very high fevers. So, I believe it's a possibility, but I don't know if that's necessarily certain. I can't know the case. I wasn't alive then. But, yeah, this character is just a really interesting character in history. It is genuinely cool. And, I was very fascinated by it. I read the whole Wikipedia page, top to bottom. So it was a very interesting read. I would highly recommend going reading it. Now, I didn't do much. I didn't deeply read much past the Wikipedia article. But yeah, like I said, there is a Wikipedia article entitled "Public Universal Friend" if you want to go read that for yourself. And I just kind of wanted to spread the word of this very interesting historical figure. I knew nothing about them, but I was going through Wikipedia. I was like, yo, Public Universal Friend? Who is this guy? Or who is this person? So, like I said, it is a great read, honestly. It's very interesting to see, what happened and how, non-cult leader this cult leader was. So, yeah. It is a very unique case, and I would highly recommend anyone reading it. We see that though this is never mentioned, like I've never heard of public universal friend before in my life, before today when I was at break in at work. So yeah, it's very odd because like they had a role, like they were prominent in the Northeast, like they had a big enough following to essentially build a commune, an entire town. So like, what's going on here? Because like even like I said, they gave a speech in front of the U.S. government and the Iroquois. Their cousin signed the Declaration of Independence. So like, why do we not hear about this? So yeah, that's really the story of Public Universal Friend. I don't think I missed anything, because yeah, that's all there really was. And yeah, like I said, that's all it really was for the Public Universal Friend. And that's kind of all I have for this little like commentary video. So thank you very much for watching.